Imagine having a car accident or having a hole in your roof or probably being laid off work simply because your company is employing the services of AI. According to a recent research by Goldman Sachs, in 20 years' time, that is by 2045, about 50% of all jobs in the US economy would be replaced likely by artificial intelligence. And for most people, that means one thing: financial distress and poverty, simply because research is proving that about 60% of all working Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. In the UK, about one-third of all the working population in the UK are actually living paycheck to paycheck, which simply means that they are just one disaster away from poverty. And so in today's video, we'll be looking at one of the key things that you can do to protect yourself and your family against the ravages of all these unforeseen circumstances happening in the economy, and that is building an emergency fund. And so if you're new here, my name is Nana. I hold a master's degree in business finance, and on this channel, we discuss everything personal finance and personal development. But before we go into the steps, there's a need for us to define some key concepts in the video. For the avoidance of doubt, an emergency fund is any funds that are specifically earmarked to take care of any emergencies or any things that are not planned for or any accidents that may likely occur, which also has the potency to actually derail you financially. This brings us to the second consideration, and that is who actually needs an emergency fund. Most people argue that if you have high income, you don't really need an emergency fund, but that is not true. Every single person out there needs an emergency fund simply because you do not know what is likely to happen in the future. You cannot actually predict the foreseeable events in the future, and that is why there is a need for you to set some funds aside or earmark funds specifically to take care of your emergency. It isn't prudent financially for you to just sell off some stock or actually liquidate some assets in order to take care of emergencies, and that is why there is a need for every single person out there to build an emergency fund aside their savings and their investment account. And so without further ado, we'll just go to the steps, and that is the first thing that you need to consider is to assess your financial situation. And let's be honest, most people or a larger contingent of people who be seeing this video are likely living paycheck to paycheck, or they don't have much saved up for any emergency. And so it is very crucial for us to approach things from there. So for instance, if you are living paycheck to paycheck or you don't have much in savings, which is likely the case, what you have to do is to try and then find ways and means of cutting back on expenses that might not be categorized as needs. So what you have to do simply is to ask yourself the simple question: what have I been spending on over the past month? If you're able to sit down and then ascertain whatever you've been spending your money on, which is easier simply because you can refer to your banking app, then it goes on to show you the areas or the gray spaces that you can actually cut back on in order to save more, and then subsequently start building your emergency fund. And that is one of the easiest ways for you to actually get started, because for most people, they don't have anything left, that is, they're living paycheck to paycheck. So the best option for them to actually go about building or starting an emergency fund would be to find ways and means of cutting down on the expenses in order to ensure that they have enough left at the end of the month for savings, and then more importantly, to earmark some funds into their emergency fund. This brings us to the second step, and that is to set a monthly savings goal. So it is very easy for you to actually set goals. However, the discipline to actually go on to realize these goals is what becomes a problem for most people. And so the best thing you can do is to just simply approach it from this perspective. Know that 1/10 of everything that you earn at the end of the month is yours to keep. And that is a timeless principle or a timeless advice that I had from George S. Clason's The Richest Man in Babylon, which is a book that is quite popular when it comes to personal finance. And so know and convince yourself that you have to save at least 1/10 of whatever you bring in at the end of the month. And that would push you and also motivate you to find ways and means of cutting back on your expenses, like we've stated earlier, and then actually sticking to the discipline or whatever goal that you set for yourself to actually realize at the end of the month. This brings us to the third step, and that is to choose where to actually save that fund. So for most people, one thing that comes to their mind anytime that they set out to just have an emergency fund or open any account is to go to the traditional banks. But in this case, what you want to do is to try as much as possible to maximize or optimize your savings as much as you can, because the ultimate goal or the ultimate rule when it comes to money, according to Warren Buffett, is to never lose money. And the only way that you can actually never lose money when it comes to savings is actually putting your money in a high yield savings account. And there are several other bank products out there that if you were to phone your bank right now and then ask them about the products that you can buy in order to actually ensure that you have enough coming in the form of interest to build an emergency fund, they would have a variety to actually recommend to you. And so the easiest thing you can do at this point is to open a high yield savings account and then put the money in there. Simply because if you're to open a traditional savings account with a traditional bank, like we mostly do in so many cases, you're likely not going to see any interest, in that inflation would eat into the savings. And then at the end of the year, you'd rather be losing money as opposed to you having to build an emergency fund or something that you can fall back on in terms of need. This brings us to the fourth step, and that is to automate your savings. So one of the key things that you need to do is to reduce the friction that is associated with savings and increase the friction associated with expenses. And that will simply ensure that you have enough left at the end of the month to save and then probably to offset any loans or go on to even build your emergency fund. And so that is one thing that you want to know. Automating savings actually ensures that the human interaction or the emotions are eradicated, which also increase your chances of having to set something aside in your savings account and even in your emergency fund as time goes on. This brings us to the fifth and the last step, and that is to monitor and adjust regularly. So for most people, anytime that they set goals financially, one thing actually sets in, that they forget the goal altogether. What you want to constantly do is to look at the goals and then find ways and means of adjusting whatever situation there is to actually meet the requirements of whatever goal that you set for yourself. And so what you can do simply is to constantly, maybe on a weekly basis, or probably to make it much more easier on a monthly basis, just sit down and ask yourself, what has changed in my finances? Have I actually gone on to earn more, or am I likely going to spend more in the near future? Make sure that all these adjustments actually reflect in your budget, and then more importantly, how much you set aside into your emergency fund. And so with the understanding and having gone through all the steps, there's one thing also that you need to know, and that is the best practices that you can adopt in order to manage your emergency fund. So the first thing that you can do is to define what an emergency is. And the purpose of this is to actually avoid you having to mix things all together, in that you know what expenses are likely going to be categorized as emergencies, which would also subsequently be drawn on your emergency fund. And you know which ones are likely to go in the form of needs or wants or things that are likely going to sustain you, like your bills. You don't have to mix all these things together. If you're able to draw a clear line between your wants, your needs, and your emergencies, it helps you to actually avoid having to draw or mixing the funds all together. Secondly, what you can do is to separate the funds. So try as much as possible to separate your savings from your emergency fund. In that, like I've stated earlier, you don't have to mix these funds. Having a clear vision as to what every single fund is meant for also ensures the discipline, and then subsequently, you're likely going to increase your chances of hitting your financial goals altogether. This brings us to the third consideration, and that is to balance debt and savings. So for instance, if you have any credit card debt or any personal loans, so what you can do simply is to offset those loans, but don't do that at the expense of your emergency fund. Try as much as possible and then make the minimum payments on those loans. However, don't do that at the expense of building your emergency fund, simply because those loans subsequently would be there, and then if you have any emergency, it will be very difficult for you to even draw on your credit card, and that is where the emergency fund comes in. But try so hard not to build that at the expense of your emergency fund, which is meant to actually cover your expenses, usually between 1 and then 6 months. This brings us to the last point, and that is consistency. And consistency is one of the main reasons why people do not become financially successful in life, simply because it is very difficult for them to find the motivation and the discipline to steer themselves subsequently towards the attainment of their goals, making those minute and marginal contributions along the line. And so thank you for spending time with us. If you found value in this video, kindly smash the like button and then consider subscribing, because we'll be shooting several videos down the line on personal finances and personal development. Thank you once again, and see you in the next video.